There are two news items that I wanted to comment on real quick because I think they are interesting and have larger things to say about American politics. The first comes out of Michigan, where Abdul El-Sayed, the Democratic candidate for Senate, recently said in an interview that he was not a socialist or a democratic socialist. He called himself a capitalist and distanced himself from the socialist label.
If I could jump in, just what makes you different than a democratic socialist?
I am not somebody who is a socialist. I believe in capitalism. I just believe that capitalism has to be regulated. If you read Adam Smith, who was one of the fathers of capitalism as we know it, he always knew that the biggest danger to capitalism wasn't government regulation, it was monopoly. And we live in a society right now where too many monopolies and oligopolies can buy politicians to get their way. It's the reason we're watching as our prices just keep going up and we keep getting further and further behind. So forgive me for actually wanting to regulate trillionaires and billionaires so that we can build schools and roads. I know you guys really desperately want to put me into a category. I'm just saying that take me on what I tell you that I'm trying to do. I've been very, very clear and consistent about the fact that I just think billionaires should pay their fair share so our kids get to go to good schools. It's not that radical.
I think this came as a surprise, a shock to some observers because El Sayed very much is a candidate of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who has distinguished himself both in winning large policy programs for Americans and in its opposition to Israel's war in Gaza and the current Israeli government altogether. And with the success of Zoran Mamdani in New York, one might ask, well, why would anyone distance himself from the socialist label? It doesn't seem to be that much of a burden. But if I put my political historian hat on real quick, all of this makes total sense to me. There is this venerable tradition in American politics of politicians decrying the term socialist, but then more or less aligning themselves with socialists in politics on key issues. The paradigmatic example of this is just Franklin Roosevelt, arguably the greatest president of the 20th century, who, by his own words, was not a socialist, who saw himself as someone who was trying to reform and save capitalism from itself. But some recent pundit hot takes aside, Roosevelt was happy to include socialists, even communists, within the larger New Deal coalition. And in fact, many of the most important New Deal programs were either proposed or piloted by socialist politicians. Direct forebearers to Mamdani in states like Wisconsin and Minnesota. You basically do not have the New Deal, whether that is the National Labor Relations Board or the Social Security Act or Public Works or anything like that, the Tennessee Valley Authority, without the work and organizing of decades of left-wing politicians and activists and so on and so forth. The New Deal, in many ways, was the synthesis of American progressivism, this technocratic administrative movement that comes out of the cities, reform-minded, but kind of elite-centered, with bottom-up, grassroots, left-wing organizing, with the American socialist movement, with American communism, this fusion of these two things into a single political tendency. When I look at a candidate like El-Sayed, that's what I see. I see someone who's working out of that tradition. You can call it left liberalism, you can call it New Deal liberalism, whatever you want to call it. It is a distinct American political tendency. And although it does not call itself socialist, it's not really hostile to socialism either. And so from my perspective, again, this is me with my political historian hat on, this makes total sense to me, and I don't see it as something to be worried about. I see it as a statement as where El-Sayed lies in the American political tradition, and quite honestly, I think that's where Mamdani is too. I think that at the moment we have a bunch of labels for what is essentially the same broad tradition, same broad tendency that has been on the back burner for many decades in the age of neoliberalism, right? The idea of a more state-directed, managed capitalism, the idea of a robust welfare state, of robust public services, that idea existed in a period of retrenchment for decades. And it's now coming back, and I find that very exciting. And I suspect we'll see even more candidates, regardless of what they call themselves, embrace this tendency in American politics, which, not for nothing, coincides with the most successful period of the Democratic Party in, I'd say, its entire history. The other thing that I found very interesting was that Rahm Emmanuel is either traveling to Israel or already has done it to deliver a speech where he says that no longer would the United States give unqualified and unlimited aid to Israel, that no longer would it stand by and allow Israel to expand its borders through the use of settlements. No longer would it allow Israel to deny Palestinians self-determination.
I came here from Chicago to tell you directly where things need to head. If we are going to maintain the historic alliance between two democracies. Without question, the alliance is at a crossroads. It cannot stand or survive as it has been. To maintain the strength of our ties, this alliance needs significant changes and a new direction.
Now, Rahm Emmanuel was Obama's chief of staff. He was mayor of Chicago. As mayor of Chicago, he covered up the murder of a teenager by Chicago police. And all around, I think Rahm Emmanuel is not a great guy. Not someone who I am particularly fond of as a politician. But the thing about Emmanuel is that he is A, the definition of a centrist, and B, ruthlessly cynical. I don't know what his true beliefs are here, but it is interesting that Rahm Emmanuel is the one staking out a position on Israel that 4 years ago, that 8 years ago, that 12 years ago would have been the far left of a Democratic primary. Now it represents, I'd say, the center, not by virtue of Emmanuel saying it, but just because it seems like it's calibrated for the middle position on Israel. And I might even say that the actual Democratic public, the voting public, is maybe somewhat to the left of Emmanuel on this. In the wake of the genocide, Democratic voters have turned sharply against support for Israel. I wrote back in 2024, I think, that Joe Biden was likely to be the last genuinely pro-Israel president, and that whether she won the election or not, Kamala Harris was going to have to deal with the fact that public opinion within the Democratic Party has shifted so sharply against Israel. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. It's not just that Gaza has become a definitional issue, I think, for many younger Democratic voters, a way for Democratic voters to ascertain whether or not a candidate is worth taking seriously. But there's also simply no political space for support for Israel within the Democratic Party anymore. And attempts to portray opposition to Netanyahu or the Israeli government or the settlements or anything related to any of that, attempts to portray that as somehow tantamount to anti-Semitism are just going to fall completely flat in the upcoming Democratic presidential primary. All right, that's all. And if anything else vaguely interesting happens, I'll be sure to have a take about it.